Well, welcome to our November webinar, where we'll be talking about managing risk to global supply chains. This is a hot topic in a world where hazards are occurring more frequently and causing greater damage. Companies and policymakers alike are really reconsidering how to make re- global value chains more resilient. And even before COVID-19, this was something that was becoming a forefront for many leaders in their organizations. So let's go ahead and begin. My name is Linda Nelson. I am the ICOR president, and will be your speaker today. One of the things that this objective might look a little bit interesting is we're going to explore the concepts of value and supply chain risk. One of the things that I found as I explored these terms in more detail is how they're often used interchangeably and how they might be used differently. And it's if in the risk world, it's kind of like using what I did a talk on a couple months ago, which was about, are we talking about enterprise risk management or operational resilience? Like, what is it that we're talking about? Are they the same things or are they different? And so part of what we're going to talk about today is really that relationship between the value and supply chain, with ultimately the objective is how can we build more resilient systems for both of those? Like every other webinar that we've done, the recording will be available on our webinar page in 2 days. We do not give you the slides. This is the most common question asked. So you will not get a copy of the slide deck, but you can view it at your leisure. If you have questions, use the questions button. I should have time today to answer questions. Otherwise, like I do for any of the other presentations, is that if there's a question that comes in that we don't get to, I will answer that after the webinar and it'll come out with your certificate. And speaking of certificates, you need to attend a minimum of 35 minutes in order to get a certificate of attendance. So let's go ahead and get started. The data or the pictures that I'm showing you come from um, the news in the United States just about a month ago, October 13th, and really looking at the Port of Los Angeles in Los Angeles, California, that's become a challenge. And the title of the article and the newscast was Supply Chain Chaos is Already Hitting Global Growth, and it's about to get worse because, of course, we want to talk about more difficult things that we need to consider in the future. Um, I know that all of us are just tired of hearing about things getting worse, but it's at least talking about them and getting an understanding of what that might look like helps us to be better prepared. And really, thanks to the rollout of the coronavirus vaccines, what we're seeing is a global economy that's slowly starting to emerge from the pandemic. But one of the things that it's done is it's left a destructive economic issue in its wake. Really, what we're seeing here is that disruption to the global supply chains. And when we saw the rapid spread of the virus prompting shutdowns in 2020 in just about every industry around the world, and while we were in lockdown, there was a lower consumer demand, and what we saw is reduced industrial activity all over the world. And as those lockdowns have lifted and then been put back in place and lifted and put back in place, what's been happening as they've really been lifted for the most part, demand has skyrocketed. It's like we're making up for lost time. And the supply chains that were disrupted during the global crisis, they're still facing huge challenges and they're struggling to bounce back as quickly as maybe some of the other industries are. And this is what has led to is some chaos, both for those manufacturers and distributors of goods, because they can't produce or supply as much as they did pre-pandemic for a lot of organizations for a variety of reasons, including things like worker shortages and a lack of key components or raw materials. You know, one of the things is, like I mentioned, it's things are probably going to get worse before they get better. And we don't like to see pictures like this at ports all around the world where there just isn't space for the ships to unload. One of the things that we're seeing is that the supply chain disruption is really interrupting our ability to kind of get back to normal. We see things like border controls and mobility restrictions. We don't have a global vaccine pass, for example, and then we've got that, like I mentioned earlier, that pent-up demand from being stuck at home, where all of a sudden we cannot get out and do things. And this is really combined for a perfect storm, where that global production is hampered because deliveries are not made in time. I was waiting for one part on a gate. I thought it would be really simple. I ordered my gate from my yard in March. It was installed last week. And I think we all have stories like that, where your product is just about ready to go, but they're missing a part or a piece, and so it can't be shipped out or it can't be installed. And so what we're seeing is, deliveries, like I said, not being made in time, prices rising, and just that, the gross um, profit isn't really going to be as robust as we would hoped. And so what we need to understand is that the supplies is going to be playing catch up for a while, particularly where there's bottlenecks in every link of the supply chain, such as labor, but also in things like containers and shipping and ports and trucks, as well as railroads and air and warehouses. One of the things that I was reading was that even just having enough warehouse space, so there's companies that are just building warehouses like crazy in order to store things so that while they're waiting to have truckers to be able to disperse those. And one of the things that we've seen is that different parts of the world have experienced different supply chain issues. And like, for example, power shortages in China have affected production more recently. Nothing COVID related, but power shortages. While Brexit in the UK has been a big factor around the shortage of truck drivers, the US and Germany are also experiencing real challenges with truck drivers, which is creating that large backlog at the ports, which is then filling the warehouses and not having enough places to put things until we can have people to distribute those. One of the reasons for having a global supply chain is to lower costs for your business, because you can get that operating costs lower due to reduced labor, and then you can link to the manufacturer of the products that you want, and then this really helps with both innovation and competition as well. But one of the things the pandemic has done is to really heighten those fragilities that we have in the networks. And so where we see a disruption in one part of the supply chain having a ripple down effect in all parts of the supply chain, and this is impacting everyone. And things like those bottlenecks, like congestion and blockages, have affected a variety of sectors, services and goods ranging from shortages of electronics and automobiles. I know that, like, even just buying a car has become a challenge, and in getting your car fixed, because we're missing things like those semiconductor chip shortages that are part of every one of those vehicles, to difficulties in getting supplies of meat and medicines and household products. We see that food going to waste because or rotting in the fields because it can't be distributed. And so when you combine that with higher consumer demand, and sorry, I forgot to turn off my phone. Um, Apologize for that. What you're seeing is the freight rates themselves are soaring because, well, now we have demand and we don't have supply. And so what that demand means that you're going to be paying more for what you have. And so that's part of what we're seeing as well with the final increase in goods and services. So the question is, what can we do about it? The COVID crisis has highlighted the interconnectedness of our countries and our economies. It's taught us that viruses and shocks and economic consequences doesn't really know any borders at all. So how can we fix it? That was really is, what can we do about it? And so as I've been talking to people, my immediate thought is we need to localize, we need to regionalize, we need to reshore, take our offshore and bring it back to our own shores. We need to get it closer to where we have it. If distribution is a problem, let's shorten our supply chain. And so this really prompted the question, really back in the middle of 2020, as they saw that this was already starting to happen, is whether more localized production of key goods would provide greater security against disruptions. And so, and really reduce that uncertainty with your consumers and your businesses. And by the way, this is where there's tons of research. So I'll mention this in our closing as well. But the fact is that I read and studied lots and lots of very technical research on the economy and economic impact of all of these things. And so what we've done here is really summarize the findings of those studies, which have come to all pretty much the same conclusion, which was good that we didn't have conflict, um, but not necessarily good for how can we fix it quickly. And so when we look at, building a business case to shift how, the geographic footprint of your supply chain, we're looking at both um, the economic factors as well as non-economic factors. So on the left, we're going to be looking at capital intensity and economies of scale. So one of the reasons, highly capital intensive value chains are really harder to move for the simple reason that they represent hundreds of billions of fixed investments. These industries have strong economies of scale, which really makes them very expensive to change or to shift. And then when we consider knowledge intensity and looking at those specialized supplier ecosystems, one of the things is that when you have specialized ecosystems that have developed in specific locations, and then you have unique suppliers and specialized talent, trying to move that production to a different location or different geography is very, very costly. And as you know, access to natural resources happen in a geography. Things like agriculture and mining and energy and wood products and basic metals are basically, they're pretty much fixed on your geology and geography and the environment where they're at. You can't just move those where it's more convenient to access them, which makes them very difficult to shift in that short or medium term. However, we are seeing in the long run that we're seeing new resource discoveries and technologies that might have a positive impact on that piece. And I talked about demand growth. So one of the things that companies do is that they want to produce their products where the demand is. So one of the examples was given as China, for example, becomes becomes more aged and prosperous, they're going to need more things like medical devices and other sorts of things. So producing those types of products in China makes sense because that's where they're going to be used. And so, those that demand growth as to where those products are going to be needed also plays an economic factor in that. And then the last economic factor is your product complexity and your substitutability of your inputs. And so here is a challenge. And I think, those of you that are in business continuity and risk management, considering things like when you have a part, they call it an input in the supply chain world, where you only have one or two suppliers in the world that can provide that, it really reduces your possibility for moving production or changing your sources. And so one of the things that companies are being challenged to do is to look at how you might more standardize some of those inputs. So things so that you have more than you're adding to the number of resources you have from your suppliers to be able to fulfill that. Now the non-economic factors tend to be more government based, like government's desire to bolster national security or national competitiveness and as well as self-sufficiency. We see that some nations are focusing on safeguarding the technologies that have dual use, like between your civilian and your military implications, which could affect value chains such as semiconductors and communication equipment. And we're going to be talking about communication equipment a lot because they're one of the things that is a huge bottleneck and they have some of the hugest risks to them as well. But with few exceptions, what we're seeing is that the economic and non-economic feasibility of geographic shifts really do not overlap. And so countries would have to be prepared to expend considerable sums in order to induce shifts from what is otherwise economically optimal production footprints. So the government itself, in a country that is a democracy, the government can't just take over and tell what they can do. Now, if you're in a country where the government owns a lot of the companies, then you might have a little bit different implications here. But one of the things, that we also need to consider here is that some governments are pursuing industrial policies intended to capture leading shares of emergency technologies. So things like quantum computing and artificial intelligence, renewable energy and electric vehicles, trying to get ahead of a piece of that so that they kind of be the sole source or the sole region for being able to purchase those things. And so the economic factors really outweigh the business case for making a change in the geography itself. So just because I wanted to be very sure, the question was asked, can the welfare losses in the US due to those unilateral decoupling of those global supply chains or global value chains, in other words, let's get away from those regions where we don't want to and really simplify our supply chain. Can that expense be reduced, be justified by reducing the exposure to the adverse supply shock, for example, in China caused by COVID? And what they're saying is that this has prompted a lot of thinking, and a lot of people have studied this about how you can reduce the reliance on imported inputs. And study after study has really shown that this is not going to pay off. It's going to expose you to more risk and it's going to cost you too much money. So the bottom line is that we really shouldn't do this. And when we looked in the US, for example, every single policy scenario that they put together to consider this made the US in worse shape than it would be if they left things the way they were. So as bad as things look, at that port that I just showed and at many of the ports around the world, if you unilaterally decouple those things, um, you're actually going to be in a worse shape than you are now. So some of this, the economics of this is well beyond my understanding, but I think we really need to trust that globally all the studies that are done are saying we shouldn't do it. And so, and it isn't going to reduce your exposure from foreign shocks. So again, even if all foreign countries experience adverse supply shocks, we all will suffer more if we kind of decouple or separate ourselves from that. So if each country decides to regionalize and make that as their primary focus, every country's going to be harmed by that. So McKinsey looked a little bit closely then is how could we shift some of those things? So instead of just decoupling them or going that major route, how can we increase our domestic productivity by every country? And so what part of the global trade could be actually subject to that? And so they came up with the statistic of 16 to 26%. However, that statistic it isn't a prediction. It's really just saying that this is what's possible, not necessarily what you should do. And so the interconnected nature of the value chains, and I keep saying supply chains, so we're going to move to that in a minute, really limits the economic case for making large-scale changes to your physical location because they span thousands of interconnected companies. The configurations themselves reflect specialization, access to specific consumer markets around the world, and you have long-standing relationships with your suppliers as well as, of course, economies of scale. What the pandemic has done, though, is driven home the importance of the fact that there are some things that we maybe should try to store or produce locally, things like food, pharmaceuticals, and medical equipment. That having this be a competitive global thing isn't good for any country. And so making sure that each country has what it needs and is self-sufficient in food and medicine and medical equipment. And so when we're looking at this, what we're seeing is that a more localized regime delivers neither greater efficiency nor greater stability. Localizing it would add to economic losses and make domestic economies very vulnerable. It also means you would have reliance on fewer sources and then often more expensive inputs. And so you'd have fewer resources and it would cost you more money. And so this really gives you greater risk, insecurity of your supply as well. And where the localization of production is costly for most developed countries, it's virtually impossible for those less developed. And so, and if you try to do this localized regime, you're also getting less protection from the impact of shocks themselves. So the answer is really, it's too late to localize. Our world is too complex, and we need to start thinking of how can we reduce risk and strengthen things in other ways. And so normally when I start out a webinar, I start off with definitions of what it is that we're talking about. So in this case, we actually are starting off putting that in the middle. And I mentioned that we're kind of using value chain and supply chain interchangeably. And In the literature that I've read, you see that oftentimes is the case, but I want us to just take a look into the differences between the value and the supply chain. So when you look at your supply chain, it generally represents the steps it takes to get the product or service to the customer. So you've got your material suppliers, you have your transportation systems, and you produce it, you market it, and you get it to your customer. Then your value chain is what they're saying is what happens, what does your customer want, and what's the planning and product development that goes into that, and then looking at how do you supply, get your suppliers and your sourcing from there. So it's more of a perspective piece. Um, and it really talks also, the value chain talks, and I talk more about value chain because I think most of us have a pretty good understanding of what supply chain is. And so really focusing on what do we mean by value chain. So it's that process in which the businesses receive their raw materials, they add value to them through production, through the manufacturing, whatever processes they have to create that finished product, and then they sell that finished product to their consumers. So if you think about it, your value chain kind of starts with your customer requirements, where your supply chain starts with your product requirements, as far as the viewpoint of where you're going with that. So your supply chain involves all parties fulfilling a customer request and leading, of course, we all want to have happy customers. But the value chain looks at, what are we also doing to create more of a competitive advantage? This chart tries to do a comparison kind of as focus. So supply chain is looking at, all of your procurement, conversion, your logistics of the product, or the value chain is looking at what kinds of things do we do to add value to the product. Your origination of your supply chain comes from operations, where your origination of value chain comes from the business side. Your main concept is conveyance, how to get things from one thing to another, where the supply value chain talks about value addition. And again, kind of the sequence, where you have a product request, you get to your suppliers and it goes to your customer, where the value chain, you might have a customer request and then you provide value to it and you provide the product. They should both lead to customer satisfaction, but the idea with the value chain is that you're also creating competitive advantage where you're producing something that somebody else is not. So the question becomes, does it matter what you call it? And in my mind, where we're going to go the rest of today is that let's just look at the supply chain as all the things, all the inputs that the company needs to produce the product. And the value chain is making sure that that product gets to your customers and that it has value to your customers. So some of the primary activities that I'm sure you're aware of are things like you have your inbound logistics. So you're receiving and you're storing and your distribution of your inputs. You've got your manufacturing operations. So how do you convert those parts or your inputs into those finished products? And then you have to ship them out. So how do you collect those? How do you store them? How do you distribute those to your customers? They need to be marketed and sold. So you need to make sure that people are aware that your product and service exists. And then there are supporting services that increase the value of that product as well. And then some of those supporting activities, look at procurement, the technology systems you have in place. You've got people that are managing that as well as an infrastructure. So what we need is those two systems to work together. And really the systems are so closely related that it's essentially looking at the same flow from those two different perspectives. So the supply chain is that flow of resources from the supplier to the customer, where the value chain looks at the flow of value as perceived by the customer from the customer to the buyer itself. So, if you have a product that you're then selling to a customer who then sells it to the buyer, and if your customer doesn't perceive value in what the supply chain provides, there's not going to be a demand. So here's where that whole supply and demand piece becomes really important. And so kind of to summarize, supply chains focus upstream on integrating supplier and producer processes, and you're looking at how can you improve efficiency and reduce waste, while value chains are focusing downstream and they're looking at ways to create value in the eyes of the customer. So here's my second question for you for today is when was the last time you really looked at how effectively your supply chain is performing? Have you really looked at all the aspects of cost, performance, quality, and value? And if you're not in the supply chain world, as a business continuity or risk person, to what extent do you ask these questions of those experts in your company when you're looking at reducing risk to your supply chain? And the question is the supply chain actually performing to the specifications of your supply chain strategy? Well, probably not right now. And so where are the weaknesses and what are the things that you need to consider? And do you even have a supply chain strategy? Becomes the next question. What is your supply chain strategy? And if you hopefully you have one, and how closely aligned is it with your corporate strategy? So as we've seen with disruptions and all of these shocks, it's really a very important time for us to be making this a key piece of what we're looking at from the business continuity and risk side of the world. And then looking at your suppliers. I know we've done other webinars and education when we talk about supply chains and saying, do they have business continuity plans? Do they have their own strategy? And the fact is here is that do your suppliers, are they aware of your supply chain strategy and their part in helping to achieve it? What is that relationship? And this is part of building strong partnerships and relationships with your critical suppliers. And so when we look at really optimizing the supply chain process, one of the things you need to do is to make sure that your strategy is aligned and supports the corporate goals for future growth and innovation and sustainability. Because I hope that your company right now isn't just treading water and trying to get through this. I hope what they're doing is looking at for opportunities that this pandemic has provided and how they can take advantage of that, and then looking at how your supply chain strategy impacts that. Making sure that you have value. So you need to identify suppliers who will assist in achieving your future goals, really in looking at how to collaborate and provide a means of growing mutual businesses through the sharing of ideas, capabilities, and capacity. So here's where we look at, building strong supplier relationships. And of course, we need to manage risk. So you should have a risk management plan for your supply chain and looking at where can we try to prevent these interruptions and unexpected events that will really render your product uncompetitive or unavailable or unattractive. So remember, once things are unavailable for a while, people make use without them, and now you've kind of lost your place in the world for what's there. You also need to have a comprehensive view of your entire supply chain. So past webinars, we've talked very much about mapping, and we're going to talk more about that today. But this is a key factor, and we're going to be talking about how hard it is to have a 360-degree comprehensive review of your suppliers. And especially if you're only looking at your current bottlenecks and not looking really towards potential future constraints as well. And like anything else, you need to have metrics. So if you're not measuring, you're not going to be able to know how to fix those problems. And so making sure when you establish a comprehensive view of your supply chain that you do that and you improve your visibility and responsiveness through all tiers. And we're going to talk more about the tiers a little bit. But one of the things we know is the pandemic has delivered the biggest and broadest value chain shock in recent memory. But we want to remind you that this is really the latest in a long series of disruptions. So, as early as 2011, that major earthquake and tsunami in Japan shut down factories that produced electric components for cars, which halted assembly lines worldwide. It also knocked out the world's top producer of advanced silicon wafers, which the semiconductor companies rely on. And then just a few months later in 2011, we had that huge flooding in Thailand, which produced roughly a quarter of the world's hard drives, which left the makers of personal computers really scrambling. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey here in the US disrupted some of the largest US oil refineries and petrochemical plants, which created shortages of plastics and resins for a range of industries. I just remember talking to a friend of mine who was in the personal care industry, and I'm like, why are all my personal care products increasing? And they said it was the packaging because they were relying, because of this outage, that they didn't have the materials for the packaging that they needed, and it was costing them more money. Therefore, the products themselves increased in cost. And then one of the things we're seeing as we see a more multipolar world, we're seeing more trade disputes, higher tariffs, and broader geopolitical uncertainty that's impacting as well. So one of the things we need to understand is that shocks that affect the global production are growing more frequent and more severe. They're not going away, and there's a wide range of hazards, from natural disasters to geopolitical uncertainties to now we're facing more and more even cyber attacks where you can't deliver products because like they've shut down your oil line, for example. Value chains are being exposed to different types of shocks based on their geographic footprint, other factors in production, as well as many other variables. Some of the things that, if you have highest trade intensity and export in just a few countries, it creates higher exposure. One of the other things that we're seeing is operational choices can either heighten or lessen vulnerability to shocks. So things like just-in-time production, sourcing from a single supplier, relying on customized inputs with very few substitutes really amplified the disruption of external shocks and can lengthen your company's recovery times. And so this is something that you really need to consider in the manufacturing aspect as well. And what we're seeing more and more is that value chain disruptions are causing substantial financial losses. And we'll look at some of the data behind that in a minute. And that this interconnectedness of the value chains as well as your supply chains really limits the economic case for making those large scale changes to the physical location. I think we've sold that to you with some of the data that we provided. And so what we really need to do is to start looking at how can we build supply chain resilience in different ways than relocating the production itself. So in this McKinsey report from middle 2020, one of the things that they're telling us is that supply chain shocks are becoming more frequent as well as more severe. So, some of the newer causes of disruptions are things like acute as well as chronic climate change. Trade disputes are becoming more volatile. Cyber attacks are in the news all the time, as well as, of course, this pandemic and suppliers themselves just going bankrupt as part of the pandemic itself. And then the length and the interval of disruptions. There's a lot of data here, and it's showing that, you can expect to have a disruption of 1 to 2 weeks every 2 years or so, and you can expect to have a disruption of more than 2 months just under 5 years. And so when you look at what that cost is going to be, if you're disrupted for 2 or more months every 5 years, there's a considerable cost to that. And then which part of our value chains are more exposed to shocks than others? So industries for semiconductors, aerospace, computers and electronics, petroleum products, apparel, which surprised me, by the way. That was something that I've really learned, interestingly, is this apparel industry, as well as what I did expect was that communication equipment. Those are the most exposed industries. And so the next thing that McKinsey did was they started to look at a classification system. And so they looked at the impact of shocks being influenced by how long it lasts, and then the ripple effects it has across those geographies and industries, and whether the shock itself hits the supply side alone or also hits the demand. So what they did is they looked at 4 categories of shocks. So unanticipated catastrophes in the upper left versus your foreseeable catastrophes. And then the bottom left is unanticipated business disruptions, as well as foreseeable disruptions. And they went from millions to trillions and moved from no disruption to months or more. And so looking at this, the black here are the most frequent. So things like theft and counterfeit, having a common cyber attack. I know that we're moving from like, oh, this is just an everyday occurrence to something more major, versus a supplier bankruptcy. These are things that might be unanticipated, but they're somewhat regular. They happen more frequently. Or things that haven't occurred yet are the gray. And then what they're saying that at scale is their qualification for that. So there has been meteor strikes, but they haven't haven't done a lot of damage, and they don't happen very often. Same thing as a solar storm. These things we think could be very catastrophic, but they haven't happened. But things like extreme terrorism and a systemic cyber attack versus a common cyber attack. But one of the things that we are seeing more often are things like the financial crisis, that they consider that foreseeable, regulatory impacts, military conflicts, and acute climatological an event like a heat wave, for example, and droughts, things that are foreseeable. We know they're coming, and they are climate-based, and they're here. So we can foresee them, and so we need to start planning for them. But some of the others that are less frequent, like a major geophysical event, or things like a hurricane and terrorism. And I do think this is interesting as well, that a pandemic is less frequent, But an extreme pandemic, hasn't happened yet. And so I wonder, what are the qualifications for the criteria for moving from a regular pandemic to an extreme pandemic? And I have to think that because of the activities and actions of all the countries around the world to help to control the pandemic, really help to keep, I don't want to say it in a positive way, but to really control the spread of the pandemic or the impact of the pandemic. And the fact that we were able to get vaccines out to people relatively quickly instead of over years is probably what also helped to and again, I don't want to say minimize the shock because it's been a huge shock. So please don't take anything that I'm saying as minimizing the impact of the pandemic, because obviously that's part of the reason for the topic for today. So one of the ways that we look at cost is that your shock exposure. So what are the types of things that could impact you? And then where are you vulnerable? Is it in your supplier network structure? Is it in your transportation and logistics? Is it in your balance sheet? Is it in all of those things? And this is where then you kind of look at your supply chain exposure and vulnerability, which then equals your value chain risk itself. And so when they're looking at this, one of the things that they said is that you should expect to lose 42% of 1 year of your earnings. This is before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That was a newer acronym for me. And so you should expect to lose that every decade. And so when you're doing your financial planning as a company, that needs to become part of your long-term financial planning, is that you have to start planning for these expected losses. And so you can build resilience into your supply chain management by, like we've talked about, increasing transparency, that we'll talk about some more, trying to minimize your exposure to shocks, as well as building your capacity to respond. And so McKinsey put out this, it's kind of a complex graph, so I broke it into pieces so that we could see it. And a number one, by the way, here is bad. So you want to have a larger number versus a smaller number. And then you want to also have a lighter color than the darker color. So having a 1 that's black is a bad thing. So the first column here is looking at your overall shock exposure, and you want to have a larger number than a smaller number. And then we look at parts of the value chains from chemical down to medical devices and all those in between. And then across the top, you have different types of shocks or hazards or threats. And what we're seeing here is that a large-scale cyber attack is where we're seeing the largest vulnerabilities for most of these industries. As the secondary one is having trade disputes where you actually can't get your products from the country where it's being produced because of trade challenges. And then when we look more horizontally, communication equipment, like I mentioned, has the biggest shock. And this is tied to having a large scale cyber attack, to actually also having some kind of geophysical event like, flooding, and they actually mentioned flooding or stress, but, hurricane or that kind of thing, as well as a trade dispute. So communication equipment is the most at risk. And the second one is our transportation equipment, which actually has a overall shock exposure of 4. But in this case, the pandemic is the biggest impact along with flooding. So these two industries have very high shock exposures, and they're very vulnerable, but for different reasons, which is really interesting, and why you need to be looking at how your geographic footprint itself exposes you and in what way. Because obviously you can't reduce risk if you don't understand what your exposure is. When we look at other industries like labor intensive, regional processing, and resource intensive, so things from furniture, textile, and apparel, to your metals and your plastics, to your more agricultural, as well as mining and petroleum products. So these are the second other categories. And we're looking at the same categories for exposure. What we saw here is that for those industries, heat stress had a much bigger impact than the other. So you can see that these industries, again, your shocks are different based on your geographic footprint, as well as what your industry is. Flooding, again, is a huge exposure, as well as the pandemic that we are in the middle of. And this was something that was really surprising to me, that the apparel industry had a really, after we look at the, we look at the communications and transportation, apparel industry came next. And they were really strongly im- um, impacted by the pandemic as well as flooding and heat stress. And then secondly, we have petroleum products themselves. So again, they were hit by the pandemic. And then their other measures were a little bit different, but their overall was a 3. And then mining. So here they were hit by a geophysical event and by flooding, and they got an overall score of 5. And so looking at your industry itself, and then where you are where your geographic footprint is, and what sorts of shocks are part of that footprint. You need to understand that for your own industry. In this study that they did, what they did is they compared a couple of companies in the same industry. So I'm just going to show you one of those. So here is where they compared Dell to Lenovo. And so here is what their focus here is that even within the same industry, companies can have very different supply chain structures, and they can have significant overlap, because what we're seeing is that companies rely on complex, multi-tiered and interconnected networks. I don't know about you, but this just looks like, maybe a 3-year-old took a crayon to things and scribbled in different colors. But if you look at the left-hand side, this is actual mapping of Dell's tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, and the same thing for Lenovo. And so when you're looking at the blue, there's over 2,200 suppliers that they share. So if those suppliers have, some kind of a vulnerability or have an interruption, they're going to impact both of those companies. And where their other suppliers are separate. But if you look, that overlap is important to understand in the industry, because um, it's something that should be well understood, that you're both relying on the same inputs, for example. The other thing understanding is that I just want to say it, this is qualified. The known tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, these are big companies, and companies that you would expect to have a pretty good handle on their suppliers, and I expect that they do, which is why they were willing to share this. So imagine what it's like for other companies that don't have as clear a vision on that. And so how can we build more resilience into our supply chain? We need to make them more transparent and resilient. We've been talking about this for years. And after every disaster, we think this is going to be the one that makes the change. But, it hasn't happened yet. We haven't seen a lot of change. And so perhaps this time it's really different, because we're seeing the price tag associated with disruptions grow. And here we are actually living out a genuine worst case scenario that's dealing the global economy a major blow. And so maybe finally the supply chain is going to get the attention it needs. And so, as we've talked about over and over again, we need to strengthen supply chain risk management and improve the end-to-end transparency. The sad thing is that only some of the largest and most advanced companies have built permanent supply chain risk management teams that are specifically made to monitor the risk and assess the potential impact of these various scenarios, and establish robust business continuity plans to keep those critical operations running. This is really where, and I think the BSI just came out with their latest supply chain survey, which again continues to show that we don't even ask the question, do our suppliers have business continuity plans in place? And so how can you have that transparency if you don't have people dedicated to making sure that is in place? And then, this risk management team that's focusing on the supply chain really needs to be that centralized nerve center that helps to coordinate all those investigations and monitoring what things might be coming. You also need to minimize your exposure to loss. So where can you mitigate your risk? Well, where can you diversify your supplier network and your geographic footprint? Where can you build in alternatives to transportation and the logistics? Where can you here's back to that, strengthening your relationship with your suppliers, make them stronger, or buy them. But you see that a lot of times is that companies will just buy a key supplier to minimize the risk and to bring that key production in-house. Move towards that modular product design with standardized inputs that we talked about. If you're relying on an input or a part that is very specific and only done in one place, How can you change the actual design of your product so that that isn't an issue? And then you also need to do the basic business continuity things, which is harden your physical assets to withstand natural disasters. Here is where the financial and operational pieces come in. You need to improve the capacity to respond and recover. So we're going back to kind of the pre just in time world, which is maybe your strategy is you're going to increase your inventory and safety stock. You're going to flex your production across different suppliers, across different production sites, and across different customer channels. You're going to create some cash flow and balance sheet buffers, which means you're putting money aside that you use when you need it and thinking about what your suppliers might need to, because if your suppliers go out of business, they're going to be a problem for you. So again, how can you strengthen your suppliers and help them with their financial help? We've talked about mapping. This map looks a lot easier than the map that we just saw with Dell and Levino. So again, but you need to map it, and you need to be looking at your inputs from your suppliers as well as your different customers and understanding how those two things work together. So looking at mapping both your supply chain and your value chain and trying to get a better view beyond your tier two suppliers and looking at who are they and what kinds of risks do they have. And one of the things that you can find out is that many companies have no idea who their suppliers are in their deeper tiers. They're really relying on their suppliers to make sure that that's working for them. And so you need that full transparency across your whole value chain, from the production of your raw materials all the way to your customer. And this really remains elusive for many companies. You also need to start using the full potential of digital to monitor and connect and collaborate across the supply chain. So we have technology in place that you should be leveraging. So using analytics, your AI, your robotics. A lot of supply chains now, you have those sensors and controls, you have tracking technologies, and you've got augmented reality. All these things are readily available. It's time for you to take advantage of those and see how they can connect your entire value chain with that seamless flow of data. And this will give you kind of that centralized control tower to give you a company-wide view of your geographies as well as your products. And I like to compare this to, before you get in your car, especially if you live in a larger city, you pull up your Google Maps to find the best route to get there based, I'm in Chicago, so where's the accidents? Where do I want to avoid? What's the fastest way I can get there? And it might not be the fewest miles. I might drive more miles and get there faster based on those. And so this is the same kind of system that you want to have for your supply chain. When Quincy did a study, like I said, mid-year last year, and they talked to global supply chain leaders and business executives as to what kinds of strategies are they putting into place to increase their supply chain resilience. 93% of them, of course, said that they're planning to do these things, and 44% of them said they're actually going to put things in place even at the expense of short-term savings. So, less than half, but that is a positive move from what we've seen in previous years. And so the largest, when you're looking at their planned actions, 53% of them are looking at dual sourcing of the raw materials. So looking at how can they get them from more than one supplier, increasing their inventory of their critical products. This is different. And then looking at nearshoring or expanding their supplier base. So just getting those suppliers closer. And then where you can, do some of that regionalization. We started out this presentation with talking about why that won't work on a global scale, but there are some parts that you can look at bringing closer. Reducing the number of SKUs in your product portfolio. So this was kind of a funny thing. Early on in the pandemic, when everybody was buying all the paper products and cleaning products, nobody could get toilet paper. Well, if you look, at how many different products, different types of toilet paper or whatever were available, in 2019. And now if you go to your stores and you look at how many types of toilet paper are available from each of those suppliers, you'll see differently. So, whatever the company name is, they might only have 3 types of toilet paper now where they had 10 before. And did we really need 10? So this is one of the things that's becoming more and more implemented, is to just reduce the number of types of things that you're providing. Also keeping higher inventory along your supply chain, doing some backup production sites, nearshoring of your own production, and then increasing the number of distribution centers. And again, your resilience strategies are going to vary by industry. So if we look at 5 of those strategies and then look at the different industries, here you can see the black is advanced electronics and semiconductors, where dual sourcing is something that about 50% of them are doing. Increasing your inventory also is kind of hiding behind there. But very few of them are nearshoring and very few of them are reducing the number of products that they have. If you look at metals and mining, you're going to see a totally different story where, they're not looking at dual sourcing because it's not really reasonable, but they are looking at increasing their inventory. They're also not really looking at nearshoring, but they are looking at how can we regionalize some of what we're doing and how can we reduce some of those. So again, looking at what it is, what by industry becomes very important as well, and that impacts your strategy. There's quite a bit that's been published by the World Trade Organization regarding COVID-19 and the global value chains. And it's a really interesting read. There's a couple of different papers that they've put out. And so I've just included this one slide a bit out of it because what they're saying is that the pandemic could contribute to diversification of sources of supply, whose extent is going to vary by sector depending on the cost of the value chain reorganization. So again, those costs become huge as we started out with that chart. One of the things that's happened though is the pandemic has led to increased attention on the provision itself of essential goods during a crisis itself. So what is it that we needed? We needed masks. Well, what they've shared here is a whole study that shows it didn't even make sense for only one country like to bring the making of masks in-house, like in country, because it was actually cheaper to continue with that globalization of those products just to make masks. And so they looked at that as well, and they continue to say that global cooperation should be preferred to national policies such as domestic production and export restrictions. So this is from the World Trade Organization. And they really concluded with that the largest risk for the global economy in the aftermath of this pandemic is to move away from our open and non-discriminatory trade policies, which are just going to jeopardize the large benefits of open trade regimes in the current global economy characterized by scale economies, innovation spillovers, and that global division of labor. So we kind of are finishing where we started, which is, as an uneducated person in the value and supply chain, my answer was, well, we've got a problem, let's fix it by bringing it regional, localize it. And the answer is no, it doesn't make any sense economic-wise, and it doesn't help anybody in the world. And this is where the World Trade Organization is confirming that response as well. So just to summarize, really coming on the heels of Brexit, and we had a flare-up with the US-China trade tensions, and then we had the pandemic. It's forced businesses to focus on building resilience in their supply chains as well as their operations. We know that not everything that can go wrong actually does go wrong, but we really can't be afford to be caught flat-footed again. And for those of you that, obviously you're on this webinar because this is what you're looking at, we're kind of preaching to the choir here. But, companies have numerous strategies available to mitigate risks and to minimize disruptions. And we all know that we should be doing this well before an event occurs, because once a crisis is in motion, we really have much fewer options to, this really isn't the time to be rebuilding your supply chain. And so understanding that investing in resilience takes discipline. It's a long-term view, but our world is increasingly volatile, and we need to start and continue to prepare for that wide range of eventualities. We can't just keep reacting to things as they happen. We have quite a few references here. We did not use all of them in this webinar, but I want you to take a look at those. And if you're looking to dig deeper in understanding into some of the summary statements that I provided, you can find them here. So we have 13 different ones. And then kind of the primary one that we looked at was the McKinsey that kind of summarized really what everybody else was saying as well. I'm happy to say that we will be finishing up 2021 with our December 15th webinar looking at culture and how it shapes behavior, which is really going to lead us into our 2022 schedule, where we're looking at resilience skills, knowledge, and behaviors. And we're going to start from looking at individual resilience and employee well-being And this is where organizational resilience begins, because organizations are run by people. And then looking at those behaviors. So we've talked about skill sets and knowledge and capabilities that companies need to have. And so now we're going to be looking at how your individuals behave in those companies, and then how that impacts the behavior of those companies and as well, and how you can increase the adaptability and flexibility of your people, how you can help people become more resourceful and creative and innovative, how you can help people become more self-aware, and make you can't really do diversity and integration with your company unless you're doing it with your people themselves. And so we look forward to this, to the upcoming. These webinars are not ready to be registered for yet. They should be up in the next week or two. And as a reminder, we do have our organizational resilience capability assessment, where you can measure your organization's resilience. And if you'd like to gain recognition from ICOR, you can get recognized for merit, for leadership, and for excellence. Don't forget to, like I said, sign up for our upcoming webinars in the next week or two. Check out our iCorrespondence newsletter. We haven't had anything published in the last couple of months, but we're looking to be publishing quite a few before the end of the year and into January. And please follow us both on our company and our LinkedIn group page. Those are the two networks that we use the most, as well as YouTube. So I actually got done for once, kind of before this actually ended, so I can take questions. If anyone has any questions, we have about 4 minutes left. And I will pause and take a deep breath while you're thinking. Otherwise, we really thank everybody for coming today, and for those of you that are listening to this on the on-demand basis as well. All right, if there aren't any questions, if you do come up with a question later, please feel free to email education@theicor.org, and we would be happy to answer individual questions. I do see one come up. Just said thank you, appreciate it. We always appreciate thank yous. As we come up with topics, also, if you have a topic that you think that you would like to learn more about that we could explore in a webinar, please send us any ideas that you might have. We have one of the ideas for this year's came from a question as to how do you measure behaviors and what do those behaviors look like in an organization, which really helped to um, inform us on where we can kind of look in the next piece of this, in these concepts of organizational resilience. And of course, the pandemic informed all of the webinars this year. But with nothing else, we thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next month.